Bonjour. Thank you for checking out the video. This is going to be the first of these. See how much attention and appreciation they get. So, what am I doing here? To answer this, I must preface a few things. I live on the autistic spectrum. And living on the autistic spectrum means that you have special interests. Things that you basically obsess over. I'm going to combine, in fact, 3 of them here. My love for this game, Battletech. I've been playing since 1990 when it was introduced in the 80s. And they've had some incarnations, tabletop role-playing games, tabletop miniatures, a slew of various computer games, video games, so on and so forth. There are a number of novels. There was a cartoon. There's so much history and backstory in this universe. It's a wonderful work of fiction, in my opinion. I love it. Number 2 on my list of special interests would be my desire to understand and to be understood with other people. I get into a bit of psychology. I have done some various religious studies, and I poke at philosophy here and there. The next applicable special interest I have is I like poking at video editing. I like doing this, so I'm learning a lot. It's a bit artistic and thoroughly enjoying it. I hope you all are as well. I have other special interests, but these are the core ones that are part of these videos. Now then, what is my plan here? My plan here is to take a bit of information that from podcasts, from various persons that are they're pushing people, they're challenging their thoughts, challenging perception, trying to diversify the way people think, trying to open them up to facts and ideas. Now, with all of that effort these folks are putting into these things, people like Joe Rogan and so forth, they're not always correct. For example, Joe Rogan on his podcast recently had a nutritionist on there that gave him quite a bit of information about obesity, because he has been very vocal about why he believes people are fat. Problem I have with that, I have people that I know personally, I care a great deal about, people I consider that are family to me, that they have medical conditions that cause them to be overweight. And Joe Rogan does not identify that factor often enough. And as fantastic as a person as he is, and the way he exchanges ideas and thoughts with folks, this is one of his failings that I would love to see him grow past, is that there are things that have to be acknowledged in our society. We are not all the same. I have what is referred to as a developmental disorder. Other people have personality disorders. people have physical disorders. Some of these things I don't like referring to as disorder because that implies there's something wrong with them. There is nothing wrong with me. Now, if someone has a personality disorder where certain chemicals are not reacting properly in their brain, then that's a disorder and that should be treated medically. For me, on the autistic spectrum, I am different. And in many ways, I think that difference is empowering. It does not hold me back. What holds me back, has held me back in the past, are not understanding why I was different. Having other people not understand why I am different. Alright, so that rant's done. Moving on. So, my intent behind this video is to take a well-known professor. He has a number of fantastic sound bites that I'm going to comment on. He was at a recent college, did a talk. The thing is that I do not fully agree with everything he says. He makes some fantastic points, talking points. But not everything he says takes into consideration all aspects of life, of humanity. He has his perspective. He relies on facts and statistics of the baseline neurotypical person. He doesn't seem to take into consideration the outliers, folks like me, who do not fit into the neurotypical box. I am neurodiverse. That's who I am. So, let me begin with this first soundbite and let you all decide for yourselves. Many of you may actually recognize his voice, but I'll let you decide for yourselves how valid his commentary is. To give you all a heads up, the gentleman is discussing doing research for a book and starting off with no assumptions.
Was this one explanation was that there's a very large number of ways that human beings could organize themselves in society, like a large number of games that we could hypothetically play, and they're all equally arbitrary in an equally arbitrary universe, and that the communists had decided to play one kind of game, and the West and the Western free market democratic types had decided to play another game, and it was all arbitrary in some sense. And so that's what I was trying to figure out, was what the hell was going on with this conflict, and was it merely a battle between two hypothetically equally valid interpretations of the world drawn from a set of extraordinarily large potential interpretations, which I think would be essentially a postmodernist take on it. And I think I went into the problem neutrally, in that I didn't think I knew what the answer was. You know, so lots of times when you talk to people who think, or when you talk to people who write, they have an idea and it's right, and then they write whatever they're writing to justify the idea. That's how they look at it. But it's not a good way to write. A good way to write and think is to have a problem and then try to solve it, right? To actually solve it, not to demonstrate that your a priori commitment is true. And you know, one of the signs, I would say, that my a priori commitments weren't the purpose for the writing was that I walked away from that 15-year project with a view of the world that was completely different than the view that I had going in, and learned all sorts of things, especially about the role of narrative and religious thinking in life that I had no idea was possible when I started. And a lot of that was a consequence of reading the great people who I read deeply. You know, I read, well, all the great works of Friedrich Nietzsche and the great works of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy and most of Jung's collected works, everything that had been published up to that point, and a very large swath of the relevant clinical literature, the great clinicians of the 20th century, and a huge stack of neuroscience and et cetera, because I was reading constantly during this time. And
now I'm going to stop at this point, and I think it should be a no-brainer that people start off as neutral as possible with any topic. Too often we are force-fed things from a very young age, and we get stuck in these almost dogmatic views of what we are told. But that also means that you have to stop and consider that things that you have learned may be wrong. And that is incredibly difficult for people. I don't personally understand why it's so difficult, but it has been demonstrated to me over and over and over that it is that difficult for folks. The next point I have here is that the speaker refers to the things that he had researched. And most of those individuals that he had researched, that he had read, many of these, if not all of them, are from the same school of thinking. Now, there's a strong possibility that the speaker had done research in other areas, and I would have liked it if in this instance to mention that he had done other schools of thought, that he had entertained them, that he had given them their due. But this is where his perspective lies the strongest. And there's nothing wrong with that. It just helps with the vetting if you can say, yes, this is what I've researched. This is also what I've researched. But I believe that the stronger case lies here. Chances are that's not going to happen simply because if you were trying to vet yourself in that kind of conversation, it would take forever to talk about all the different schools of thought you'd researched. But I would like it if folks would at least mention that they didn't hold the same ideals exclusively. They didn't entertain just one school of thought all the time.
I realized some things that I think are true. The communists were wrong. They weren't, and not just a little bit wrong, and not wrong in some arbitrary way. They were playing a game that human beings cannot play without descending into a murderous catastrophe. And there's something about what we've done in the West that's correct. And it's hard, it's complicated because our cognitive structures, that's one way of thinking about it, or our socio-political arrangements, they actually parallel one another in an important way, are grounded in a strange set of axioms, and the axioms aren't rational precisely. It's more like they're narrative. They're narrative axioms. They're stories. And the story of the West is that the individual is sovereign over the group, and that that's the solution to tribalism.
Now, the point that he's made here is extremely important, I believe, right now in our modern political setup. Personally, I am extreme center. What do I mean by that? Let me quantify. I believe that you can both be a classical liberal, hold classical liberal values, and libertarian values. Some of them may be exclusive, but I do not believe that all of them are mutually exclusive. So, in this case, his reference for his book is explorations of politics and psychology. In my opinion, that is extremely valid. And if nothing else, what validates this thinking is the fact that we have the history to prove what's going on. Now, there are folks that are pro-communist, pro-socialist, and their first response is that it's never been done correctly. That's how they justify their view on it, even though it's proven to be murderous. Millions of people dead because of communism. And it's because of individuals that take advantage of communism to gain power. How do we avoid that? That would require that we remove what makes us human from the equation. You can't have a socialist society unless you give people a positive outlet for aggressive tendencies. You cannot have communism or socialism when there is scarcity. It doesn't work. If you could first remove scarcity, and then, well, no, first you would have to teach people how to find fulfillment on their own. They have to be self-motivated to empower themselves in a positive direction with a life that they can be proud of. And this is an issue that extends in many different directions. It's very, very difficult to figure out how to fix.
There isn't a higher value than free speech. It isn't free speech. It's not the right way of thinking about it because it's free thought. And even that's not the right way of thinking about it because thought is the precursor to action and life. So there's no difference between free speech and free life.
This is something that I extremely agree with. It's a strong basis on which to look at the fact that we can criticize anyone at any time, and our government cannot punish us for doing so. If we disagree with the government, rationally or irrationally, if we disagree with anyone, rationally or irrationally, we're free to do so. We are free to be ourselves. And here's another point, is that when you're free to be yourself and everyone else is too, it is easier to identify what kind of person someone is. This is exceedingly important to me. Because if someone has values that crosses a line with me, or runs outside of what my personal boundaries are, then it is easier to identify and avoid involving my time and energy with said person. Being on the autistic spectrum, another aspect of this is extreme difficulties in interacting socially with other people. I have a difficult time reading social cues that most people that are referred to as neurotypical. You don't have a personality disorder, you don't have a developmental disorder. You function just fine as an individual human being, the way human beings are expected to in society. You are neurotypical. Alright, that said, as someone on the spectrum, I have an inability to read social cues, certain social cues. Some of them are just fine. I have a very good social mask. I've learned a lot in the years that I've been an adult. However, there is a challenge that I live with that prevents me from effectively interacting with others. So, free speech is so vital, in my opinion, and to me personally, because I can identify how you decide to live your life, and I can decide whether or not I can interact with you in a healthy way. If I decide that I cannot interact with an individual in a healthy way, then I can just avoid them. I can boycott their business. I can make the choices that I have to that are correct and right for me and my personal boundaries. This next sound clip has a lot to do with how people are as people, how they are as individuals. And he expresses an opinion about people's stories that if he would apply them in a broader fashion, would completely take care of my initial criticism.
If you want to find out whether the person is there or the ideology is there, you listen to see if you're hearing anything that someone else of the same ideological mindset couldn't have told you. You know, like I've had thousands of conversations with people because I've spent 20 years as a clinical psychologist, and one of the things I've learned about people is that they're unbelievably interesting. If you get someone to sit down and you move past the superficial, which you can actually do quite rapidly, they'll tell you all sorts of things that only they know, that are unbelievably enlightening about their own peculiar problems about the way they look at the world, about their idiosyncratic familial dynamics, like just fascinating personal stuff. It's the stuff of great novels, you know, and this is ordinary people. I don't really think there is an ordinary person exactly. There's the facade of ordinariness, but behind that, people are very rarely ordinary. And so the conversations are almost instantaneously fascinating. And one of the guidelines that I used in my clinical practice constantly was, like, I had this sense, I probably learned this mostly from Carl Rogers, was that if the conversation wasn't really interesting, then we weren't doing anything that was therapeutically useful. But all of the interesting elements of it were very, very personal.
Right here, he expresses one of the fundamental things about human interaction that I absolutely love. This is one of my favorite things about human interaction. Who are you? What have you lived? What has happened in your life to shape you as you are? This is incredibly fascinating to me. I love being able to have deep and meaningful conversations with people. It is truly a fantastic thing. The previous conversation to this video clip, or audio clip rather, was discussing people that were being judgmental, people that are parroting ideology. And this happens way too often, where people just parrot this information without developing their own thoughts, their own ideas. They're just mimicking others.
And so to replace this, and I learned this mostly from Alexander Solzhenitsyn in his detailed analysis of what I would call ideological possession. He talked about people he met in the Gulag camps who were under the sway of rigid communist orthodoxy, and noted very clearly that it was like there was a crank in some sense on the side of their head, and you could just crank the crank and out would come the ideological dogma, and it's all entirely predictable. And people who are in a situation like that don't understand that they're possessed by an idea, right? Carl Jung said people don't have ideas, ideas have people. And it's like, so there's nothing in that that's anything other than exactly what you would predict. And then there's a deeper issue too, and this is one that I think has bedeviled me ever since I made my initial videos, which is it's impossible for those on the radical left to admit that anyone who opposes what they're doing might be reasonable, because what that would mean would be that you could be reasonable and oppose the radical left, and that would imply that what the radical left was doing wasn't reasonable.
In this specific statement, he is referring to one aspect, one group within our political structure. But this is fairly universal to anyone who doesn't take the initial stance about a topic that they might be wrong, that they may not have all of the facts, that they might misremember something. I am extremely guilty of arguing things that I have misremembered. And it's not until Google is a fantastic, wonderful thing. Otherwise, I'd be spouting off half-assed information all the time. Being able to vet ideas in moments during a conversation, and not having to go to the Encyclopedia Britannica like you did in the 90s and previously. It's an amazing tool that more people need to use and utilize. And they need to use it to think and to reason. Don't go for the irrational perspective that you've always held, that you're always correct. Because if you do not vet yourself all the time, constantly, in real time, you are in danger of giving out the wrong information, of expressing an idea incorrectly, of improperly representing yourself and others.
And so, instead of dealing with the fact that I actually happen to be quite reasonable, the attempt is to assume that anyone who objects must be part of the radical right. It's like, well, actually, no. There's lots of space between the radical left and the radical right. There's the moderate, reasonable left, for example, and then there's the center, and then there's the moderate, reasonable right, and then there's the far right, and then there's the extreme right. All of that exists in opposition to the radical left.
And this is where tribalism is extremely detrimental. Because if you do not agree with your tribal groupthink, or someone, anyone, not just you, with a tribal groupthink, then you get labeled all these horrendous things that are completely unreasonable and irrational.
So one of the things that I've been thinking about deeply over the last couple of weeks and plan to write about, here's a mystery for all of you. I don't care what your political background is. It isn't like I'm anti-left. I've made videos documenting this. I know why there's a left wing. There's a left wing because inequality is a problem. It's a way worse problem than the radical leftists like to admit, because you can't lay it at the feet of capitalism and the free market. Inequality is a way worse problem than that. But it's definitely a problem. And because inequality is a problem, you need part of the political structure to speak up for the people who end up arrayed at the bottom of hierarchies. It's crucial. Someone has to speak for them. That's the place of the left. But then consider this. So we can state that the right speaks for hierarchy and the left speaks on behalf of those who are oppressed by inequality. Good. We need that dialogue. The radical left. Okay. We know from 20th century history that things can go too far on the right, no one disputes that, and that things can go too far on the left. And we also know that when things go too far, it's seriously not good, right? So when things went too far on the right, then we had 120 million people die in the Second World War. And when things went too far on the left, we had God only knows how many people murdered as a consequence of internal repression, at least 100 million. And we risked putting the entire planet, we risked putting the planet into flames. Okay, so that's the consequence. All right, so now, in the aftermath of World War II, let's say we've come to some sort of sociological agreement, I would say, that you can identify the radical right-wingers. When people make claims of racial superiority, you put them in a box, you say, well, you're outside of acceptable political discourse. And so you saw that with William F. Buckley in the 60s when he started his conservative review. He dissociated himself from the David Duke types, and you saw it more recently with people, for example, like Ben Shapiro, who immediately distanced himself from the Charlottesville types. Okay, so now we kind of have a sense of where you've crossed the damn line in your ethno-nationalism, right? As soon as you move into the racial superiority domain, ethnic superiority domain, it's like, no, you've got to be dangerous. All right, here's a question. Where the hell do you cross the line on the left? Exactly. Well, the answer is who knows? Well, that's not a very good answer. I would say it's incumbent on people in the center and in the moderate left to say, look, things can go too far on the left. And here's how we know that's happened. And that hasn't happened at all. Now, I think there's a reason for that. I think there's a technical reason as well as a motivational reason. Two technical reasons. It's harder for people on the left to draw boundaries because people on the left aren't boundary drawing types. They're boundary dissolving types, temperamentally speaking. So that's a problem. The second problem is it doesn't look to me like there is a smoking pistol on the left that's as obvious as racial superiority doctrines. You know, it's like in Canada, there's a lot of push for this triumvirate of radical ideas: diversity, inclusivity, and equity. Which diversity, it's like, well, who's against that? It's like being against poverty. Inclusivity, well, yes, of course we want people included. Equity, that's a more bitter pill to swallow because that's equality of outcome. And for me, that's a marker. It's like if you're talking about equality of outcome, you've gone too far. And if you're talking about diversity, inclusivity, and equality of outcome, equity, then you've gone too far. And you might disagree. You might disagree. And that's fine. Disagree. If that isn't the marker for going too far, then what's the marker? Because obviously you can go too far. And obviously that's not good. And to close on that, I would also say to the people on the moderate left, if you want your doctrines to have purchase and to continue to speak for those who stack up at the bottom of inevitable hierarchies, then you owe it to yourself to dissociate yourself from the dangerous radicals, because otherwise they invalidate your ideas.
They invalidate your ideas. I have made that argument to so many people on all sides of the political spectrum for so long. And it is so gratifying to hear someone say that. Someone who is learned, and sometimes I have issues with what he says, but that right there is so crucial. An important topic was touched on there as well, and that is the concept of equity. I am a firm believer in personal empowerment. This means equality of opportunity. Having equal outcome is so inherently wrong, and it hurts people. You do not want that outcome, because if you have equality of outcome, that means, for example, in medicine, that every hospital has to have specific people of specific demographics, things that are completely immutable characteristics. So the hospital doesn't get to choose someone that is capable as a doctor. They have to overlook that person because they already have too many people that are of whatever categorization they use. It's English sometimes. So, instead of getting the best, they have to get someone who's potentially further down the line to fill these arbitrary requirements, and people are going to be hurt over it because they want to empower a immutable trait over raw skill. And I'm sorry, I prefer raw skill. And for those of you who, bring up affirmative action, things like that, as a way to prevent biases and empower folks that would otherwise be left out, I understand your point. But that is what the moderate left is for, is to help overcome prejudices. There's that balance. Trying to empower equality amongst opportunity. It's damn difficult. How long have we been at it and we still don't get it right all the time? So now I'm going to make the big reveal. The person we've been listening to, his name is Professor Jordan Peterson. He's a clinical psychologist, and he has been rather controversial lately, the past year and a half or so. I don't think that the majority of what he says is unreasonable. There are other things that he has said that are, but very little here has been unreasonable. I think in the next video I do, might start touching on some of those other things that I strongly disagree with. But I hope I've given you something to think about, something to consider, and that your perspective may have shifted. That is really what I am hoping. Professor Peterson has a YouTube channel. He puts out much of his information out for free. So he only makes money on his patronage. And that's fantastic that he is in that position to share his knowledge, share ideas, and not make money off of it, not monetize it any more than what people are willing to give him. So, if you're interested in that, by all means, look him up. And he goes in many, many different directions. He gets into Judaic-Christian concepts. He gets into so much, but from a extremely clinical perspective, a very academic way of looking at things. Even when he gets religious, it is strongly focused on the academic. So, I'm going to end the video here. If you enjoyed it, thumbs up. If you didn't, thumbs down. Either way, give me a comment. Let me know what you think about the video. I really look forward to getting some feedback. Thank you. And au revoir.